Volume 1, Chapter 16 of Clayhanger, by Arnold BENNETT. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16. The Letter. Then there was roast goose for dinner, and Clara amused herself by making silly facetious faces, furtively, dangerously, under her father's very eyes. The children feared goose for their father, whose digestion was usually unequal to this particular bird. Like many fathers of families in the Five Towns, he had the habit of going forth on Saturday mornings to the butcher's or the poulterer's, and buying Sunday's dinner. He was a fairly good judge of a joint, but Maggie considered herself to be his superior in this respect. However, Darius was not prepared to learn from Maggie, and his purchases had to be accepted without criticism. At a given meal Darius would never admit that anything chosen and bought by him was not perfect; but a week afterwards, if the fact was so, he would of his own accord recall imperfections in that which he had asserted to be perfect. And he would do this without any shame, without any apparent sense of inconsistency or weakness. Edwin noticed a similar trait in other grown-up persons, and it astonished him. It astonished him especially in his father, who, despite the faults and vulgarities which his fastidious son could find in him, always impressed Edwin as a strong man, a man with the heroic quality of not caring too much what other people thought. When Edwin saw his father take a second plateful of goose, with the deadly stuffing thereof, Darius simply could not resist it; like most dyspeptics, he was somewhat greedy. He foresaw an indisposed and perilous father for the morrow, which prevision was supported by Clara's pantomimic antics, and even by Maggie's grave and restrained sigh. Still, he had sworn to write and send the letter, and he should do so. A career, a lifetime, was not to be at the mercy of a bilious attack, surely. Such a notion offended logic and proportion, and he scorned it away. TWO. The meal proceeded in silence. Darius, as in duty bound, mentioned the sermon, but neither Clara nor Edwin would have anything to do with the sermon, and Maggie had not been to chapel. Clara and Edwin felt themselves free of piety till 6 o'clock at least, and they doggedly would not respond. And Darius, from prudence, did not insist, for he had arrived at chapel unthinkably late, during the second chant, and Clara was capable of audacious remarks upon occasions. The silence grew stolid, and Edward wondered what the dinner table of the Orgreaves was like, and he could smell fresh mortar. And he dreamed of a romantic life, he knew not what kind of life, but something different fundamentally from his own. He suddenly understood with sympathy the impulse which made boys run away to sea. He could feel the open sea; he could feel the breath of freedom on his cheek. He said to himself: "Why shouldn't I break this ghastly silence by telling father out loud here that he mustn't forget what I told him that night in the attic? I'm going to be an architect. I'm not going to be any blooming printer. I'm going to be an architect. Why haven't I mentioned it before? Why haven't I talked about it all the time? Because I'm an ass. Because there's no word for what I am. Damn it! I suppose I'm the person to choose what I'm going to be. I suppose it's my business more than his. Besides, he can't possibly refuse me. If I say flatly that I won't be a printer, he's done. This idea of writing a letter is just like me. Coward! Coward! What's my tongue for? Can't I talk? Isn't he bound to listen? All I have to do is to open my mouth. He's sitting there. I'm sitting here. He can't eat me. I'm in my rights. Now suppose I start on it as soon as Mrs Nixon has brought the pudding and pie in." And he waited anxiously to see whether he indeed would be able to make a start after the departure of Mrs Nixon. THREE. Hopeless! He could not bring himself to do it. It was strange, it was disgusting. No, he would be compelled to write the letter. Besides, the letter would be more effective. His father could not interrupt the letter by some loud illogical remark. Thus he salved his self-conceit. He also sought relief in reflecting savagely upon the speeches that had been made against him in the debate. He went through them all in his mind. There was the slimy idiot from Baines, it was in such terms that his thoughts ran, who gloried in never having read a word of Colenso, and called the assembled company to witness that nothing could ever induce him to read such a godless author, going about in the mask of a so-called bishop. But had any of them read Colenso, except possibly Llewellyn Roberts, who in his Welsh way would pretend ignorance, and then come out with a quotation and refer you to the exact page? Edwin himself had read very little of Colenso, and that little only because a customer had ordered the second part of the Pentateuch, and he had stolen it for a night. Colenso was not in the Free Library. What a world! What a debate! Still he could not help dwelling with pleasure on Mr Roberts' insistence on the brilliant quality of his brains. Astute as Mr Roberts was, the man was clearly in awe of Edwin's brains. Why? To be honest, Edwin had never been deeply struck by his own brain power, and yet there must be something in it. "Of course," he reflected sardonically, "my father doesn't show the faintest interest in the debate. Yet he knew all about it, and that I had to open it." But he was glad that his father showed no interest in the debate. Clara had mentioned it in the presence of Maggie, with her usual ironic intent, and Edwin had quickly shut her up. FOUR. In the afternoon, the sitting room being made uninhabitable by his father's goose-ridden dozes, he went out for a walk. The weather was cold and fine. When he returned, his father also had gone out. The two girls were lolling in the sitting room. An immense fire, built up by Darius, was just ripe for the beginning of decay, and the room very warm. Clara was at the window, Maggie in Darius's chair, reading a novel of Charlotte M. Yonge's. On the table, open, was a bound volume of the Family Treasury of Sunday Reading, in which Clara had been perusing the chronicles of the Schonberg Cotta family with feverish interest. Edwin had laughed at her ingenuous absorption in the adventures of the Schonberg Cotta family, but the fact was that he had found them rather interesting in spite of himself, while pretending the contrary. There was an atmosphere of high obstinate effort and heroical foreignness about the story which stimulated something secret in him that seldom responded to the provocation of a book. More easily would this secret something respond to a calm evening, or a distant prospect, or the silence of early morning when by chance he looked out of his window. The volume of the Family Treasury, though 5 years old, was a recent acquisition. It had come into the house through the total disappearance of a customer, who had left the loose numbers to be bound in 1869. Edwin dropped sideways on to a chair at the table, spread out his feet to the right, pitched his left elbow a long distance to the left, and his head resting on his left hand, turned over the pages with his right hand idly. His eye caught titles such as "The Door Was Shut," "My Mother's Voice," "The Heather Mother," "The Only Treasure," "Religion and Business," "Hope to the End," "The Child of Our Sunday School," "Satan's Devices," and "Studies of Christian Life and Character, Hannah More." Then he saw an article about some architecture in Rome, and he read: "In the Sistine picture there is the struggle of a great mind to reduce within the possibilities of art a subject that transcends it. That mind would have shown itself to be greater, truer, at least in its judgement of the capabilities of art, and more reverent to have left it alone." The seriousness of the whole magazine intimidated him into accepting this pronouncement for a moment, though his brief studies in various encyclopaedias had led him to believe that the Sistine Chapel, shown in an illustration in Cazenove, was high beyond any human criticism. His elbow slid on the surface of the table, and in recovering himself he sent the Family Treasury on the floor, wrong side up, with a great noise. Maggie did not move. Clara turned and protested sharply against this sacrilege, and Edwin, out of mere caprice, informed her that her precious magazine was the most stinking silly pious thing that ever was. With haughty and shocked gestures she gathered up the volume and took it out of the room. "I say, Mag," Edwin muttered, still leaning his head on his hand and staring blankly at the wall. The fire dropped a little in the grate. "What is it?" asked Maggie, without stirring or looking up. "Has father said anything to you about me wanting to be an architect?" He spoke with an affectation of dreaminess. "About you wanting to be an architect?" repeated Maggie, in surprise. "Yes," said Edwin. He knew perfectly well that his father would never have spoken to Maggie on such a subject, but he wanted to open a conversation. "No fear!" said Maggie, and added in her kindest, most encouraging, elder sisterly tone, "Why?" "Oh " He hesitated, drawling. And then he told her a great deal of what was in his mind, and she carefully put the wool marker in her book and shut it, and listened to him, and the fire dropped and dropped comfortably. She did not understand him. Obviously she thought his desire to be an architect exceedingly odd, but she sympathised. Her attitude was soothing and fortifying. After all, he reflected, Maggie's all right. There's some sense in Maggie. He could get on with Maggie. For a few moments he was happy and hopeful. "I thought I'd write him a letter," he said. "You know how he is to talk to." There was a pause. "What do you think?" he questioned. "I should," said Maggie. "Then I shall!" he exclaimed. "How do you think he'll take it?" "Well," said Maggie, "I don't see how he can do aught but take it all right. Depends how you put it, of course." "Oh, you leave that to me," said Edwin, with eager confidence. "I shall put it all right. You trust me for that." FIVE. Clara danced into the room, flowing over with infantile joy. She had been listening to part of the conversation behind the door. "So he wants to be an architect! An architect! Architect!" She half sang the word in a frenzy of ridicule. She really did dance, and waved her arms. Her eyes glittered as if in rapture. These singular manifestations of her temperament were caused solely by the strangeness of the idea of Edwin wanting to be an architect. The strange sight of him, with his hair cut short or in a new necktie, affected her in a similar manner. "Clara, go and put your pinafore on this instant," said Maggie. "You know you oughtn't to leave it off." "You needn't be so hoity-toity, miss," Clara retorted. But she moved to obey. When she reached the door she turned again and gleefully taunted Edwin. "And it's all because he went for a walk yesterday with Mr Orgreave. I know! I know! You needn't think I didn't see you, because I did. Architect! Architect!" She vanished, on all her springs, spitefully graceful. "You might almost think that infernal kid was right bang off her head," Edwin muttered crossly. Still, it was extraordinary how that infernal kid hit on the truth. Maggie began to mend the fire. "Oh, well!" murmured Maggie, conveying to Edwin that no importance must be attached to the chit's chittiness. He went up to the next flight of stairs to his attic. Dust on the table of his work attic! Shameful dust! He had not used that attic since Christmas, on the miserable plea that winter was cold and there was no fireplace. He blamed himself for his effeminacy. Where had flown his seriousness, his elaborate plans, his high purposes? A touch of winter had frightened them away. Yes, he blamed himself mercilessly. True it was, as that infernal kid had chanted, a casual half hour with Mr Orgreave was alone responsible for his awakening, at any rate for his awakening at this particular moment. Still, he was awake. That was the great fact. He was tremendously awake. He had not been asleep; he had only been half asleep. His intention of becoming an architect had never left him. But through weakness before his father, through a cowardly desire to avoid disturbance and postpone a crisis, he had let the week slide by. Now he was in a groove, in a canyon. He had to get out, and the sooner the better. A piece of paper, soiled, was pinned on his drawing board. One or two sketches lay about. He turned the drawing board over so that he might use it for a desk on which to write the letter. But he had no habit of writing letters. In the attic was to be found neither ink, pen, paper, nor envelope. He remembered a broken quire of sermon paper in his bedroom. He had used a few sheets of it for notes on Bishop Colenso. These notes had been written in the privacy and warmth of bed, in pencil. But the letter must be done in ink. The letter was too important for pencil. Assuredly his father would take exception to pencil. He descended to his sister's room and borrowed Maggie's ink and a pen, and took an envelope, tripping like a thief. Then he sat down to the composition of the letter, but he was obliged to stop almost immediately in order to light the lamp. SIX. This is what he wrote: "Dear Father, I dare say you will think it queer me writing you a letter like this, but it is the best thing I can do, and I hope you will excuse me. I dare say you will remember I told you that night when you came home late from Manchester, here in the attic, that I wanted to be an architect. You replied that what I wanted was business experience. If you say that I have not had enough business experience yet, I agree to that, but I want it to be understood that later on, when it is the proper time, I am to be an architect. You know I am very fond of architecture, and I feel that I must be an architect. I feel I shall not be happy in the printing business, because I want to be an architect. I am now nearly 17. Perhaps it is too soon yet for me to be apprenticed to an architect, and so I can go on learning business habits. But I just want it to be understood. I am quite sure you wish me to be happy in life, and I shan't be happy if I'm always regretting that I have not gone in for being an architect. I know I shall like architecture. Your affectionate son, Edwin Clayhanger." Then, as an afterthought, he put the date and his address at the top. He meditated a postscript, asking for a reply, but decided that this was unnecessary. As he was addressing the envelope, Mrs Nixon called out to him from below to come to tea. He was surprised to find that he had spent over an hour on the letter. He shivered and sneezed. SEVEN. During tea he felt himself absurdly self-conscious, but nobody seemed to notice his condition. The whole family went to chapel. The letter lay in his pocket, and he might easily have slipped away to the post office with it, but he had had no opportunity to possess himself of a stamp. There was no need to send the letter through the post. He might get up early and put it among the morning's letters. He had decided, however, that it must arrive formally by the postman, and he would not alter his decision. Hence, after chapel, he took a match, and, creeping into the shop, procured a crimson stamp from his father's desk. Then he went forth by the back way, alone, into the streets. The adventure was not so hazardous as it seemed and as it felt. Darius was incurious by nature, though he had brief fevers of curiosity. Thus the life of the children was a demoralising mixture of rigid discipline and freedom. They were permitted nothing, but, as the years passed, they might take nearly anything. There was small chance of Darius discovering his son's excursion. In crossing the road from chapel, Edwin had opined to his father that the frost was breaking. He was now sure of it. The mud, no longer brittle, yielded to pressure, and there was a trace of dampness in the interstices of the pavement bricks. A thin raw mist was visible in huge spheres round the street lamps. The sky was dark. The few people whom he encountered seemed to be out upon mysterious errands, seemed to emerge strangely from one gloom, and strangely to vanish into another. In the blind black facades of the streets, the public houses blazed invitingly with gas. They alone were alive in the weekly death of the town. And they gleamed everywhere, at every corner. The town appeared to consist chiefly of public houses. He dropped the letter into the box in the market-place. He heard it fall. His heart beat. The deed was now irrevocable. He wondered what Monday held for him. The quiescent melancholy of the town invaded his spirit, and mingled with his own remorseful sorrow for the unstrenuous past, and his apprehensive solicitude about the future. It was not unpleasant, this brooding sadness, half despondency and half hope. A man and a woman, arm in arm, went by him as he stood unconscious of his conspicuousness under the gas lamp that lit the post office. They laughed the smothered laugh of intimacy to see a tall boy standing alone there, with no overcoat, gazing at naught. Edwin turned to go home. It occurred to him that nearly all the people he met were couples, arm in arm. And he suddenly thought of Florence, the clog dancer. He had scarcely thought of her for months. The complexity of the interests of life, and the interweaving of its moods, fatigued his mind into an agreeably grave vacuity. CHAPTER XVI. The Letter. Chapter 17 of Clayhanger by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17. End of a Struggle. It was not one of his official bilious attacks that Darius had on the following day. He only yielded himself up in the complete grand manner when nature absolutely compelled. The goose had not formally beaten him, but neither had he formally beaten the goose. The battle was drawn, and this meant that Darius had a slight headache, a feeling of heavy disgust with the entire polity of the universe, and a disinclination for food. The first and third symptoms he hid as far as possible from pride. At breakfast he toyed with bacon, from pride, hating bacon. The children knew from his eyes and his guilty gestures that he was not well, but they dared not refer to his condition. They were bound to pretend that the health of their father flourished in the highest perfection, and they were glad that things were no worse. On the other hand, Edwin had a sneezing cold which he could not conceal, and Darius inimicably inquired what foolishness he had committed to have brought this on himself. Edwin replied that he knew of no cause for it. A deliberate lie. He knew that he had contracted a chill while writing a letter to his father in an unwarmed attic, and had intensified the chill by going forth to post the letter without his overcoat in a raw evening mist. Obviously, however, he could not have stated the truth. He was uncomfortable at the breakfast table, but, after the first few moments, less so than during the disturbed night he had feared to be. His father had neither eaten him, nor jumped down his throat, nor performed any of those unpleasant, miraculous feats which fathers usually do perform when infuriated by filial foolishness. The letter, therefore, had not been utterly disastrous. Sometimes a letter would ruin a breakfast, for Mr Clayhanger, with no consideration for the success of meals, always opened his post before bite or sup. He had had the letter, and still he was ready to talk to his son in the ordinary grim tone of a goose morrow, which was to the good. Edwin was now convinced that he had done well to write the letter. TWO. But as the day passed, Edwin began to ask himself, "Has he had the letter?" There was no sign of the letter in his father's demeanour, which, while not such as to make it credible that he ever had moods of positive gay roguishness, was almost tolerable, considering his headache and his nausea. Letters occasionally were lost in the post, or delayed. Edwin thought it would be just his usual bad luck if that particular letter, that letter of all letters, should be lost. And the strange thing is that he could not prevent himself from hoping that it indeed was lost. He would prefer it to be lost rather than delayed. He felt that if the postman brought it by the afternoon delivery, while he and his father were in the shop together, he should drop down dead. The day continued to pass, and did pass, and the shop was closed. "He'll speak to me after supper," said Edwin. But Darius did not speak to him after supper. Darius put on his hat and overcoat and went out, saying no word except to advise the children to be getting to bed, all of them. As soon as he was gone, Edwin took a candle and returned to the shop. He was convinced now that the letter had not been delivered, but he wished to make conviction sure. He opened the desk. His letter was nearly the first document he saw. It looked affrighting, awful. He dared not read it to see whether its wording was fortunate or unfortunate. He departed, mystified. Upstairs in his bedroom he had a new copy of an English translation of Victor Hugo's Notre Dame, which had been ordered by Lawyer Lawton, but would not be called for till the following week, because Lawyer Lawton only called once a fortnight. He had meant to read that book, with due precautions, in bed. But he could not fix attention on it. Impossible for him to follow a single paragraph. He extinguished the candle. Then he heard his father come home. He thought that he scarcely slept all night. THREE. The next morning, Tuesday, the girls, between whom and their whispering friend Miss Ingamells something feminine was evidently afoot, left the breakfast table sooner than usual, not without stifled giggles. Upon occasion Maggie would surprisingly meet Clara and Miss Ingamells on their own plane. Since Sunday afternoon she had shown no further interest in Edwin's important crisis. She seemed, so far as he could judge, to have fallen back into her customary state of busy apathy. The man and the young man were alone together. Darius, in his satisfaction of having been delivered so easily from the goose, had taken an extra slice of bacon. Edwin's cold was now fully developed, and Maggie had told him to feed it. "I suppose you got that letter I wrote you, father, about me going in for architecture?" said Edwin. Then he blew his nose to hide his confusion. He was rather startled to hear himself saying those bold words. He thought that he was quite calm and in control of his impulses, but it was not so. His nerves were stretched to the utmost. Darius said nothing, but Edwin could see his face darkening, and his lower lip heavily falling. He glowered, though not at Edwin. With eyes fixed on the window, he glowered into vacancy. The pride went out of Edwin's heart. "So ye'd leave the printing," muttered Darius, when he'd finished masticating. He spoke in a menacing voice thick with ferocious emotion. "Well," said Edwin, quaking. He thought he had never seen his father so ominously intimidating. He was terrorised as he looked at that ugly and dark countenance. He could not say any more. His voice left him. Thus his fear was physical as well as moral. He reflected: "Well, I expected a row, but I didn't expect it would be as bad as this." And once more he was completely puzzled and baffled by the enigma of his father. FOUR. He did not hold the key, and even had he held it he was too young, too inexperienced, to have used it. As with gathering passion the eyes of Darius assaulted the window pane, Darius had a painful intense vision of that miracle, his own career. Edwin's grand misfortune was that he was blind to the miracle. Edwin had never seen the little boy in the Bastille, but Darius saw him always, the infant who had begun life at a rope's end. Every hour of Darius's present existence was really an astounding marvel to Darius. He could not read the newspaper without thinking how wonderful it was that he should be able to read the newspaper. And it was wonderful. It was wonderful that he had 3 different suits of clothes, none of them with a single hole. It was wonderful that he had 3 children, all with complete outfits of good clothes. It was wonderful that he never had to think twice about buying coal, and that he could have more food than he needed. It was wonderful that he was not living in a 2-roomed cottage. He never came into his house by the side entrance without feeling proud that the door gave on to a preliminary passage and not direct into a living-room. He would never lose the idea that a lobby, however narrow, was the great distinguishing mark of wealth. It was wonderful that he had a piano, and that his girls could play it and could sing. It was wonderful that he had paid 28 shillings a term for his son's schooling, in addition to book money. 28 shillings a term! And once a penny a week was considered enough, and 2d generous. Through sheer splendid wilful pride he had kept his son at school till the lad was 16 going on 17. 17, not 7. He had had the sort of pride in his son that a man may have in an idle, elegant, and absurdly expensive woman. It even tickled him to hear his son called Master Edwin, and then Mr Edwin, just as the fine ceremonious manners of his sister-in-law, Mrs Hamps, tickled him. His marriage! With all its inevitable disillusions, it had been wonderful, incredible. He looked back on it as a miracle. For he had married far above him, and had proved equal to the enormously difficult situation. Never had he made a fool of himself. He often took keen pleasure in speculating upon the demeanour of his father, his mother, his little sister, could they have seen him in his purple and in his grandeur. They were all dead, and those days were fading, fading, gone, with their unutterable, intolerable shame and sadness, intolerable even in memory. And his wife dead too. All that remained was Mr Shushions. And then his business! Darius's pride in the achievement of his business was simply indescribable. If he had not built up that particular connexion, he had built up another one whose sale had enabled him to buy it, and he was waxing yearly. His supremacy as a printer could not be challenged in Bursley. Steam! A double-windowed shop! A foreman to whom alone he paid 30 shillings a week! 4 other employees! Not to mention a domestic servant. How had he done it? He did not know. Certainly he did not credit himself with brilliant faculties. He knew he was not brilliant. He knew that once or twice he had had luck. But he had the greatest confidence in his rough-hewing common sense. The large curves of his career were correctly drawn. His common sense, his slow shrewdness, had been richly justified by events. They had been pitted against foes, and look now at the little boy from the Bastille. FIve. To Darius there was no business quite like his own. He admitted that there were businesses much bigger, but they lacked the miraculous quality that his own had. They were not sacred. His was, genuinely. Once, in his triumphant and vain early manhood, he had had a fancy for bulldogs. He had bred bulldogs. And one day he had sacrificed even that great delight at the call of his business. And now no one could guess that he knew the difference between a setter and a mastiff. It was this sacred business, perpetually adored at the secret altar in Darius's heart, this miraculous business, and not another, that Edwin wanted to abandon, with scarcely a word, just casually. True, Edwin had told him one night that he would like to be an architect, but Darius had attached no importance to the boyish remark. Darius had never even dreamed that Edwin would not go into the business. It would not have occurred to him to conceive such a possibility. And the boy had shown great aptitude. The boy had saved the printing office from disaster. And Darius had proved his satisfaction therein, not by words certainly, but beyond mistaking in his general demeanour towards Edwin. And after all that, a letter! Mind you, a letter! Proposing with the most damnable insolent audacity that he should be an architect, because he would not be happy in the printing business. An architect! Why an architect specially? What in the name of God was there to attract in bricks and mortar? He thought the boy had gone off his head for a space. He could not think of any other explanation. He had not allowed the letter to upset him. By his armour of thick callousness he had protected the tender places in his soul from being wounded. He had not decided how to phrase his answer to Edwin. He had not even decided whether he would say anything at all, whether it would not be more dignified and impressive to make no remark whatever to Edwin, to let him slowly perceive, by silence, what a lamentable error he had committed. And here was the boy, lightly, cheekily talking at breakfast about going in for architecture. The armour of callousness was pierced. Darius felt the full force of the letter. And as he suffered, so he became terrible and tyrannic in his suffering. He meant to save his business, to put his business before anything. And he would have his own way. He would impose his will. And he would have treated argument as a final insult. All the heavy, obstinate, relentless force of his individuality was now channelled in one tremendous instinct. SIX. "Well, what?" he growled savagely, as Edwin halted. In spite of his advanced age, Edwin began to cry. Yes, the tears came out of his eyes. "And now you begin blubbing," said his father. "You say naught for 6 months, and then you start writing letters," said his father. "And what's made ye settle on architecting, I'd like to be knowing?" Darius went on. Edwin was not able to answer this question. He had never put it to himself. Assuredly he could not, at the pistol's point, explain why he wanted to be an architect. He did not know. He announced this truth ingenuously. I don't know. I should think not," said his father. "Do you think architecting'll be any better than this?" This meant printing. I don't know." "You don't know! You don't know!" Darius repeated testily. His testiness was only like foam on the great wave of his resentment. "Mr Orgreave," Edwin began. It was unfortunate, because Darius had had a difficulty with Mr Orgreave, who was notoriously somewhat exacting in the matter of prices. "Don't talk to me about Mr Orgreave!" Darius almost shouted. Edwin didn't. He said to himself, "I'm lost." "What's this business of mine for, if it isn't for you?" asked his father. "Architecting. There's neither sense nor reason in it. Neither sense nor reason." He rose and walked out. Edwin was now sobbing. In a moment his father returned, and stood in the doorway. "You've been doing well, I'll say that. And I've shown it. I was beginning to have hopes of you." It was a great deal to say. He departed. "Perhaps if I hadn't stopped his damned old machine from going through the floor he'd have let me off," Edwin muttered bitterly. "I've been too good. That's what's the matter with me." SEVEN. He saw how fantastic was the whole structure of his hopes. He wondered that he had ever conceived it even wildly possible that his father would consent to architecture as a career. To ask it was to ask absurdly too much of fate. He demolished with a violent and resentful impulse the structure of his hopes, stamped on it angrily. He was beaten. What could he do? He could do nothing against his father. He could no more change his father than the course of a river. He was beaten. He saw his case in its true light. Mrs Nixon entered to clear the table. He turned away to hide his face and strode passionately off. 2 hours elapsed before he appeared in the shop. Nobody asked for him, but Mrs Nixon knew he was in the attic. At noon, Maggie, with a peculiar look, told him that Auntie Hamps had called, and that he was to go and have dinner with her at 1:00, and that his father consented. Obviously Maggie knew the facts of the day. He was perturbed at the prospect of the visit, but he was glad. He thought he could not have lived through a dinner at the same table as Clara. He guessed that his auntie had been made aware of the situation and wished to talk to him. 8. "Your father came to see me in such a state last night," said Auntie Hamps, after she had dealt with his frightful cold. Edwin was astonished by the news. Then after all his father had been afraid? After all, perhaps he had yielded too soon. If he had held out, if he had not been a baby... But it was too late. The incident was now closed. Mrs Hamps was kind, but unusually firm in her tone, which reached a sort of benevolent severity. "Your father had such high hopes of you. Has, I should say. He couldn't imagine what on earth possessed you to write such a letter. And I'm sure I can't. I hope you're sorry. If you'd seen your father last night you would be, I'm sure." "But look here, auntie," Edwin defended himself, sneezing and wiping his nose. And he spoke of his desire. Surely he was entitled to ask, to suggest. A son could not be expected to be exactly like his father. And so on. No, no! She brushed all that aside. She scarcely listened to it. "But think of the business! And just think of your father's feelings!" Edwin spoke no more. He saw that she was absolutely incapable of putting herself in his place. He could not have explained her attitude by saying that she had the vast unconscious cruelty which always goes with a perfect lack of imagination. But this was the explanation. He left her, saddened by the obvious conclusion that his auntie, whom he had always supported against his sisters, was part author of his undoing. She had undoubtedly much strengthened his father against him. He had a gleam of suspicion that his sisters had been right, and he wrong about Mrs Hamps. Wonderful, the cruel, ruthless insight of girls into some things! NINE. Not till Saturday did the atmosphere of the Clayhanger household resume the normal. But earlier than that Edwin had already lost his resentment. It disappeared with his cold. He could not continue to bear ill will. He accepted his destiny of immense disappointment. He shouldered it. You may call him weak, or you may call him strong. Maggie said nothing to him of the great affair. What could she have said? And the affair was so great that even Clara did not dare to exercise upon it her peculiar faculties of ridicule. It abashed her by its magnitude. On Saturday Darius said to his son good humouredly "Canst be trusted to pay the wages?" Edwin smiled. At 1:00 he went across the yard to the printing office with a little bag of money. The younger apprentice was near the door scrubbing type with potash to cleanse it. The backs of his hands were horribly raw and bleeding with chaps, due to the frequent necessity of washing them in order to serve the machines, and the impossibility of drying them properly. Still, winter was ending now, and he only worked 11 hours a day in an airy room, instead of 19 hours in a cellar, like the little boy from the Bastille. He was a fortunate youth. The journeyman stood idle as often on Saturdays. The length of the journeyman's apron had been reduced by deliberate tearing during the week from 3 feet to about a foot, so imperious and sudden was the need for rags in the processes of printing. Big James was folding up his apron. They all saw that Edwin had the bag, and their faces relaxed. "You're as good as the master now, Mr Edwin," said Big James, with a ceremonious politeness and a fine gesture, when Edwin had finished paying. "Am I?" he rejoined simply. Everybody knew of the great affair. Big James's words were his gentle intimation to Edwin that every one knew the great affair was now settled. That night, for the first time, Edwin could read Notre Dame with understanding and pleasure. He plunged with soft joy into the river of the gigantic and formidable narrative. He reflected that after all the sources of happiness were not exhausted. CHAPTER 18. Chapter 1 of Clayhanger by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, His Love. Chapter 1, The Visit. We now approach the more picturesque part of Edwin's career. 7 years passed. Towards the end of April 1880, on a Saturday morning, Janet Orgreave, second daughter of Osmond Orgreave, the architect, entered the Clayhanger shop. All night an April shower lasting 10 hours had beaten with persistent impetuosity against the window panes of Bursley, and hence half the town had slept ill. But at breakfast time the clouds had been mysteriously drawn away, the winds had expired, and those drenched streets began to dry under the caressing peace of bright soft sunshine. The sky was pale blue, of a delicacy unknown to the intemperate climes of the south. Janet Orgreave, entering the Clayhanger shop, brought into it with her the new morning weather. She also brought into it Edwin's fate, or part of it, but not precisely in the sense commonly understood when the word fate is mentioned between a young man and a young woman. A youth stood at the left-hand or fancy counter, very nervous. Miss Ingamells, that was married and the mother of 3 children, and had probably forgotten the difference between demi and post octavos. And this youth had taken her place, and the place of 2 unsatisfactory maids in black who had succeeded her. None but males were now employed in the Clayhanger business, and everybody breathed more freely. Round sound oaths were heard where never oaths had been heard before. The young man's name was Stifford, and he was addressed as Stiff. He was a proof of the indiscretion of prophesying about human nature. He had been the paper boy, the minion of Edwin, and universally regarded as unreliable and almost worthless. But at 16 a change had come over him. He parted his hair in the middle instead of at the side, arrived in the morning at 7:59 instead of at 8:05, and seemed to see the earnestness of life. Every one was glad and relieved. But every one took the change as a matter of course. The attitude of every one to the youth was, "Well, it's not too soon." No one saw a romantic miracle. "I suppose you haven't got the Light of Asia in stock?" began Janet Orgreave, after she had greeted the youth kindly. "I'm afraid we haven't, miss," said Stifford. This was an understatement. He knew beyond fear that the Light of Asia was not in stock. "Oh!" murmured Janet. "I think you said the Light of Asia." "Yes, the Light of Asia, by Edwin Arnold." Janet had a persuasive, humane smile. Stifford was anxious to have the air of obliging this smile, and he turned round to examine a shelf of prize books behind him, well aware that the Light of Asia was not among them. He knew the Light of Asia, and was proud of his knowledge. That is to say, he knew by the visible and tactual evidence that such a book existed, for it had been ordered and supplied as a Christmas present 4 months previously, soon after its dazzling apparition in the world. "Yes, by Edwin Arnold, Edwin Arnold," he muttered learnedly, running his finger along gilded backs. "It's being talked about a great deal," said Janet, as if to encourage him. "Yes, it is. No, I'm very sorry we haven't it in stock." Stifford faced her again, and leaned his hands wide apart on the counter. "I should like you to order it for me," said Janet Orgreave, in a low voice. She asked this exactly as though she were asking a personal favour from Stifford the private individual. Such was Janet's way. She could not help it. People often said that her desire to please and her methods of pleasing were unconscious. These people were wrong. She was perfectly conscious and even deliberate in her actions. She liked to please. She could please easily, and she could please keenly. Therefore she strove always to please. Sometimes when she looked in the mirror and saw that charming good-natured face with its rich vermilion lips eager to part in a nice warm sympathetic smile, she could accuse herself of being too fond of the art of pleasing. For she was a conscientious girl, and her age being 25, her soul was at its prime, full, bursting with beautiful impulses towards perfection. Yes, she would accuse herself of being too happy, too content, and would wonder whether she ought not to seek heaven by some austerity of scowling. Janet had everything: a kind disposition, some brains, some beauty, considerable elegance and luxury for her station, fine shoulders at a ball, universal love and esteem. Stifford, as he gazed diffidently at this fashionable, superior, and yet exquisitely beseeching woman on the other side of the counter, was in a very unpleasant quandary. She had, by her magic, transformed him into a private individual, and he acutely wanted to earn that smile which she was giving him. But he could not. He was under the obligation to say `no' to her innocent and delightful request. And yet, could he say no? Could he bring himself to desolate her by a refusal? She had produced in him the illusion that a refusal would indeed desolate her, though she would of course bear it with sweet fortitude. Business was a barbaric thing at times. "The fact is, miss," he said at length, in his best manner, "Mr Clayhanger has decided to give up the new book business. I'm very sorry." Had it been another than Janet, he would have assuredly said with pride, "We have decided." "Really," said Janet. "I see." Then Stifford directed his eyes upon a square glazed structure of ebonised wood that had been insinuated and inserted into the opposite corner of the shop, behind the ledger window. And Janet's eyes followed his. "I don't know if," he hesitated. "Is Mr Clayhanger in?" she demanded, as if wishful to help him in the formulation of his idea, and added, "Or Mr Edwin?" Deliciously persuasive. TWO. The wooden structure was a lair. It had been constructed to hold Darius Clayhanger, but in practice it generally held Edwin, as his father's schemes for the enlargement of the business carried him abroad more and more. It was a device of Edwin's for privacy. Edwin had planned it and seen the plan executed. The theory was that a person concealed in the structure, called the office, was not technically in the shop, and must not be disturbed by anyone in the shop. Only persons of authority, Darius and Edwin, had the privilege of the office, and since its occupant could hear every whisper in the shop, it was always for the occupant to decide when events demanded that he should emerge. On Janet's entrance, Edwin was writing in the day book: "April 11th, Turnhill Oddfellows, 400 contrib. Cards." He stopped writing. He held himself still like a startled mouse. With satisfaction he observed that the door of the fortress was closed. By putting his nose near the crystal wall he could see through the minute transparent portions of the patterned glass without being seen. He watched Janet's graceful gestures, and examined with pleasure the beauties of her half seasoned toilette. He discerned the modishness of her umbrella handle. His sensations were agreeable and yet disagreeable, for he wished both to remain where he was and to go forth and engage her in brilliant small talk. He had no small talk, except that of the salesman and the tradesman. His tongue knew not freedom. But his fancy dreamed of light intellectual conversations with fine girls. These dreams of fancy had of late become almost habitual, for the sole reason that he had raised his hat several times to Janet, and once had shaken hands with her and said, "How do you do, Miss Orgreave?" in response to her "How do you do, Mr Clayhanger?" Osmond Orgreave, in whom had originated their encounter, had cut across the duologue at that point and spoiled it. But Edwin's fancy had continued it, when he was alone late at night, in a very diverting and witty manner. And now he had her at his disposal. He had only to emerge, and Stiff would deferentially recede, and he could chat with her at ease, starting comfortably from "The Light of Asia." And yet he dared not. His faint heart told him in loud beats that he could only chat cleverly with a fine girl when absolutely alone in his room, in the dark. Still he surveyed her. He added her up. He pronounced, with a touch of conventional male patronage, caught possibly from the Liberal Club, that Janet was indubitably a nice girl and a fine girl. He would not admit that he was afraid of her, and that despite all theoretical argufying he deemed her above him in rank. And if he had known the full truth, he might have regretted that he had not caused the lair to be furnished with a trapdoor, by means of which the timid could sink into the earth. The truth was that Janet had called purposely to inspect Edwin at leisure. The Light of Asia was a mere poetical pretext. The Light of Asia might as easily have been ordered at Hanbridge, where her father and brothers ordered all their books. In fact, more easily. Janet, with all her niceness, with all the reality of her immense good nature, loved as well as anybody a bit of chicane where a man was concerned. Janet's eyes could twinkle as mischievously as her quiet mother's. Mr Orgreave, having in the last 8 months been in professional relations with Darius and Edwin, The Orgreave household had begun discussing Edwin again. Mr Orgreave spoke of him favourably. Mrs Orgreave said that he looked the right sort of youth, but that he had a peculiar manner. Janet said that she should not be surprised if there was something in him. Janet said also that his sister Clara was an impossible piece of goods, and that his sister Maggie was born an old maid. One of her brothers then said that that was just what was the matter with Edwin too. Mr Orgreave protested that he wasn't so sure of that, and that occasionally Edwin would say things that were really rather good. This stimulated Mrs Orgreave's curiosity, and she suggested that her husband should invite the young man to their house. Whereupon Mr Orgreave pessimistically admitted that he did not think Edwin could be enticed. And Janet, piqued, said, "If that's all, I'll have him here in a week." They were an adventurous family, always ready for anything, always on the lookout for new sources of pleasure, full of zest in life. They liked novelties, and hospitality was their chief hobby. They made fun of nearly everybody, but it was not mean fun. Such, and not the light of Asia, was the cause of Janet's visit. THREE. Be it said, to Edwin's shame, that she would have got no further with the family plot that morning had it not been for the chivalry of Stifford. Having allowed his eyes to rest on the lair, Stifford allowed his memory to forget the rule of the shop, and left the counter for the door of the lair, determined that Miss Orgreave should see the genuineness of his anxiety to do his utmost for so sympathetic a woman. Edwin, perceiving the intention from his lair, had to choose whether he would go out or be fetched out. Of course he preferred to go out. But he would never have gone out on his own initiative. He would have hesitated until Janet had departed, and he would then have called himself a fool. He regretted, and I too regret, that he was like that. But like that he was. He emerged with nervous abruptness. "Oh, how do you do, Miss Orgreave?" he said. "I thought it was your voice." After this he gave a little laugh, which meant nothing, certainly not amusement. It was merely a gawky habit that he had unconsciously adopted. Then he took his handkerchief out of his pocket and put it back again. Stifford fell back, and had to pretend that nothing interested him less than the interview which he had precipitated. "How do you do, Mr Clayhanger?" said Janet. They shook hands. Edwin wrung Janet's hand, another gawky habit. "I was just going to order a book," said Janet. "Oh yes, `The Light of Asia,'" said Edwin. "Have you read it?" Janet asked. "Yes, that is, a lot of it." "Have you?" exclaimed Janet. She was impressed, because really the perusal of verse was not customary in the town. And her delightful features showed generously the full extent to which she was impressed, an honest, ungrudging appreciation of Edwin's studiousness. She said to herself, "Oh, I must certainly get him to the house." And Edwin said to himself, "No mistake, there's something very genuine about this girl." Edwin said aloud quickly, from an exaggerated apprehensiveness lest she should be rating him too high, "It was quite an accident that I saw it. I never read that sort of thing, not as a rule." "Ha!" He laughed again. "Is it worth buying?" Now she appealed to him as an authority. She could not help doing so, and in doing so she was quite honest, for her good nature had momentarily persuaded her that he was an authority. "I don't know," Edwin answered, moving his neck as though his collar was not comfortable. But it was comfortable, being at least a size too large. "It depends, you know. If you read a lot of poetry it's worth buying, but if you don't, it isn't. It's not Tennyson, you know. See what I mean?" "Yes, quite," said Janet, smiling with continued and growing appreciation. The reply struck her as very sagacious. She suddenly saw in a new light her father's hints that there was something in this young man not visible to everybody. She had a tremendous respect for her father's opinion, and now she reproached herself in that she had not attached due importance to what he had said about Edwin. "How right father always is!" she thought. Her attitude of respect for Edwin was now more securely based upon impartial intelligence than before. It owed less to her weakness for seeing the best in people. As for Edwin, he was saying to himself, "I wish to the devil I could talk to her without spluttering. Why can't I be natural? Why can't I be glib? Some chaps could." And Edwin could be, with some chaps. FOUR. They were standing close together in the shop, Janet and Edwin, near the cabinet of artists' materials. Janet, after her manner at once frank and reassuring, examined Edwin. She had come on purpose to examine him. She had never been able to decide whether or not he was good looking, and she could not decide now. But she liked the appeal in his eyes. She did not say to herself that there was an appeal in his eyes. She said that there was something in his eyes. Also, he was moderately tall, and he was slim. She said to herself that he must be very well shaped. Beginning at the bottom, his boots were clumsy, his trousers were baggy and even shiny, and they had transverse creases, not to be seen in the trousers of her own menkind. His waistcoat showed plainly the forms of every article in the pockets thereof: watch, penknife, pencil, etc. It was obvious that he never emptied his pockets at night. His collar was bluish white instead of white, and its size was monstrous. His jacket had worked up at the back of his neck, completely hiding his collar there. The side pockets of his jacket were weighted and bulged with mysterious goods. His fair hair was rough, but not curly. He had a moustache so trifling that one could not be sure whether it was a moustache or whether he had been too busy to think of shaving. Janet received all these facts into her brain, and then carelessly let them all slip out again, in her preoccupation with his eyes. She said they were sad eyes. The mouth, too, was somewhat sad, she thought, but there was a drawing down of the corners of it that seemed to make gentle fun of its sadness. Janet, perhaps out of her good nature, liked his restless, awkward movements, and the gesture of his hands, of which the articulations were too prominent and the finger-nails too short. "Tom reads rather a lot of poetry," said Janet. "That's my eldest brother." "That might justify you," said Edwin doubtfully. They both laughed. As with Janet, so with Edwin, when he laughed, all the kindest and honestest part of him seemed to rise into his face. "But if you don't supply new books any more?" "Ah!" Edwin stuttered, blushing slightly. "That's nothing. I shall be very pleased to get it for you specially, Miss Orgreave. It's father that decided only last month that the new book business was more trouble than it's worth. It was, in a way, but I'm sorry, myself, we've given it up, poor as it was. Of course there are no book buyers in this town, especially now old Lawton's dead. But still, what with one thing or another, there was generally some book on order, and I used to see them. Of course there's no money in it, but still... Father says that people buy less books than they used to, but he's wrong there." Edwin spoke with calm certainty. "I've shown him he's wrong by our order book, but he wouldn't see it." Edwin smiled with a general mild indulgence for fathers. "Well," said Janet, "I'll ask Tom first." "No trouble whatever to us to order it for you, I assure you. I can get it down by return of post." "It's very good of you," said Janet, genuinely persuading herself for the moment that Edwin was quite exceeding the usual bounds of complaisance. She moved to depart. "Father told me to tell you, if I saw you, that the glazing will all be finished this morning," said she. "Up yonder?" Edwin jerked his head to indicate the south. And Janet delicately confirmed his assumption with a slight declension of her waving hat. "Oh, good!" Edwin murmured. Janet held out her hand to be wrung again, and assured him of her gratitude for his offer of taking trouble about the book. And he assured her that it would not be trouble but pleasure. He accompanied her to the doorway. "I think I must come up and have a look at that glazing this afternoon," he said, as she stood on the pavement. She nodded, smiling benevolence and appreciation, and departed round the corner in the soft sunshine. Edwin put on a stern, casual expression for the benefit of Stifford, as who should say, "What a trial these frivolous girls are to a man immersed in affairs!" But Stifford was not deceived. Safe within his lair, Edwin was conscious of quite a disturbing glow. He smiled to himself, a little self consciously, though alone. Then he scribbled down in pencil: "Light of Asia, Miss J. Orgreave." Volume 2, Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Clayhanger, by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2. Father and Son after 7 years. Darius came heavily and breathing heavily into the little office. "Now as all this racketing's over," he said crossly. He meant by racketing the general election, which had just put the Liberal party into power. "I'll thank ye to see as all the red and blue ink is cleaned off the rollers and slabs, and the types cleaned too. I've told 'em 10 times if I've told 'em once, and as far as I can make out, they've done naught to it yet." Edwin grunted without looking up. His father now was a fattish man, and he had aged quite as much as Edwin. Some of his scanty hair was white, the rest was grey. White hair sprouted about his ears, gold gleamed in his mouth, and a pair of spectacles hung insecurely balanced half-way down his nose. His waistcoat seemed to be stretched tightly over a perfectly smooth hemisphere. He had an air of somewhat gross and prosperous untidiness. Except for the teeth, his bodily frame appeared to have fallen into disrepair, as though he had ceased to be interested in it, as though he had been using it for a long time as a mere makeshift lodging. And this impression was more marked at table. He ate exactly as if throwing food to a wild animal concealed somewhere within the hemisphere, an animal which was never seen, but which rumbled threateningly from time to time in its dark dungeon. Of all this Edwin had definitely noticed nothing save that his father was getting stouter. To Edwin, Darius was exactly the same father, and for Darius Edwin was still aged 16. They both of them went on living on the assumption that the world had stood still in those 7 years between 1873 and 1880. If they had been asked what had happened during those 7 years, they would have answered, "Oh, nothing particular." But the world had been whizzing ceaselessly from one miracle into another. Board schools had been opened in Bursley, wondrous affairs with ventilation. Indeed, ventilation had been discovered. A Jew had been made Master of the Rolls, a spectacle at which England shivered, and then, perceiving no sign of disaster, shrugged its shoulders. Irish members had taught the House of Commons how to talk for 24 hours without a pause. The wages of the agricultural labourer had sprung into the air and leapt over the 12-shilling bar into regions of opulence. Moody and Sankey had found and conquered England for Christ. Landseer and Livingstone had died, and the provinces could not decide whether dignity and impudence or the penetration of Africa was the more interesting feat. Herbert Spencer had published his Study of Sociology, Matthew Arnold his Literature and Dogma, and Frederick Farrar his Life of his Lord. But here the provinces had no difficulty in deciding, for they had only heard of the last. Every effort had been made to explain by persuasion and by force to the working man that trade unions were inimical to his true welfare, and none had succeeded, so stupid was he. The British Army had been employed to put reason into the noddle of a town called Northampton, which was furious because an atheist had not been elected to Parliament. Pullman cars, the Pirates of Penzance, Henry Irving's Hamlet, spelling bees, and Captain Webb's Channel Swim had all proved that there were novelties under the sun. Bishops and archbishops and dissenting ministers had met at Lambeth to inspect the progress of irreligious thought, with intent to arrest it. Princes and dukes had conspired to inaugurate the most singular scheme that ever was, the Curl Society, for bringing beauty home to the people by means of decorative art, gardening, and music. The Bulgarian atrocities had served to give new life to all penny gaffs and blood tubs. The Eurydice and the Princess Alice had foundered in order to demonstrate the uncertainty of existence and the courage of the island race. The 19th century had been started, a little late in the day, and the Referee. Ireland had all but died of hunger, but had happily been saved to enjoy the benefits of coercion. The Young Men's Christian Association had been born again in the splendour of Exeter Hall. Bursley itself had entered on a new career as a chartered borough, with mayor, aldermen, and councillors all in chains of silver. And among the latest miracles were Northampton's success in sending the atheists to Parliament, the infidelity of the Tay Bridge 3 days after Christmas, the catastrophe of Majuba Hill, and the discovery that soldiers objected to being flogged into insensibility for a peccadillo. But, in spite of numerous attempts, nobody had contrived to make England see that her very existence would not be threatened if museums were opened on Sunday, or that nonconformists might be buried according to their own rites without endangering the constitution. Two. Darius was possibly a little uneasy in his mind about the world. Possibly there had just now begun to form in his mind the conviction, in which most men die, that all was not quite well with the world, and that in particular his native country had contracted a fatal malady since he was a boy. He was a printer, and yet the general election had not put sunshine in his heart. And this was strange, for a general election is the brief millennium of printers, especially of steam printers, who for dispatch can beat all rivals. During a general election the question put by a customer to a printer is not "How much will it be?" but "How soon can I have it?" There was no time for haggling about price, and indeed to haggle about price would have been unworthy, seeing that every customer, ordinary business being at a standstill, was engaged in the salvation of England. Darius was a Liberal, but a quiet one, and he was patronised by both political parties, blue and red. As a fact, neither party could have done without him. His printing office had clattered and thundered early and late, and more than once had joined the end of one day's work to the beginning of another. And more than once had Big James, with his men and his boy, a regiment increased since 1873, stood like plotters muttering in the yard at 5 minutes to 12 on Sunday evening, waiting for midnight to sound, and Big James had unlocked the door of the office on the new-born Monday, and work had instantly commenced to continue till Monday was nearly dead of old age. Once only had work been interrupted, and that was on a day when, a lot of blue jobs being about, a squad of red fire-eaters had come up the back alley with intent to answer arguments by thwackings and wreckings. But the obstinacy of an oak door had fatigued them. The staff had enjoyed that episode. Every member of it was well paid for overtime. Darius could afford to pay conscientiously. In the printing trade prices were steadier then than they are now. But already the discovery of competition was following upon the discovery of ventilation. Perhaps Darius sniffed it from a distance and was disturbed thereby. Three. For though he was a Liberal in addition to being a printer, and he had voted Liberal, and his party had won, and yet the general election had not put sunshine in his heart. No, the tendency of England worried him. When he read in a paper about the heretical tendencies of Robertson Smith's biblical articles in the Encyclopaedia Britannica, he said to himself that they were of a piece with the rest, and that such things were to be expected in those modern days, and that matters must have come to a pretty pass when even the Encyclopaedia Britannica was infected. Still, he had sold a copy of the new edition. He was exceedingly bitter against Ireland, and also in secret, behind Big James's back, against trade unions. When Edwin came home one night and announced that he had joined the Bursley Liberal Club, Darius lost his temper. Yet he was a member of the club himself. He gave no reason for his fury, except that it was foolish for a tradesman to mix himself up with politics. Edwin, however, had developed a sudden interest in politics, and had made certain promises of clerical aid, which promises he kept, saying nothing more to his father. Darius's hero was Sir Robert Peel, simply because Sir Robert Peel had done away with the Corn Laws. Darius had known England before and after the repeal of the Corn Laws, and the difference between the two Englands was so strikingly dramatic to him that he desired no further change. He had only one date, 1846. His cup had been filled then. Never would he forget the scenes of anguishing joy that occurred at midnight of the day before the new Act became operative. From that moment he had finished with progress. If Edwin could only have seen those memories shining in layers deep in his father's heart, and hidden now by all sorts of Pliocene deposits, he would have understood his father better. But Edwin did not see into his father's heart at all, nor even into his head. When he looked at his father he saw nothing but an ugly, stertorous old man, old, that is, to Edwin, with a peculiar and incalculable way of regarding things, and a temper of growing capriciousness. FOur. Darius was breathing and fidgeting all over him as he sat bent at the desk. His presence overwhelmed every other physical phenomenon. "What's this?" asked Darius, picking up a bit of paper on which Edwin had written the memorandum about the Light of Asia. Edwin explained self-consciously, lamely. When the barometer of Darius's temper was falling rapidly, there was a sign. A small spot midway on the bridge of his nose turned ivory white. Edwin glanced upwards now to see if the sign was there, and it was. He flushed slightly and resumed his work. Then Darius began. "What did I tell you?" he shouted. "What in the name of God's the use of me telling you things? Have I told you not to take any more orders for books, or haven't I? Haven't I said over and over again that I want this shop to be known for wholesale?" he raved. FIVE. Stifford could hear. Any person who might chance to come into the shop would hear. But Darius cared neither for his own dignity nor for that of his son. He was in a passion. The real truth was that this celibate man, who never took alcohol, enjoyed losing his temper. It was his one outlet. He gave himself up almost luxuriously to a passion. He looked forward to it as some men look forward to brandy. And Edwin had never stopped him by some drastic step. At first, years before, Edwin had said to himself, trembling with resentment in his bedroom, "The next time, the very next time he humiliates me like that in front of other people, I'll walk out of his damned house and shop, and I swear I won't come back until he's apologised. I'll bring him to his senses. He can't do without me. Once for all, I'll stop it. What? He forces me into his business and then insults me!" But Edwin had never done it. Always it was the very next time. Edwin was not capable of doing it. His father had a sort of moral brute force against which he could not stand firm. He soon recognised this with his intellectual candour. Then he had tried to argue with Darius, to make him see. Worse than futile. Argument simply put Darius beside himself, so that in the end Edwin employed silence and secret scorn as a weapon and as a defence. And somehow, without a word, he conveyed to Stifford and to Big James precisely what his attitude in these crises was, so that he retained their respect and avoided their pity. The outburst still wounded him, but he was wonderfully inured. As he sat writing under the onslaught, he said to himself, "By God, if I ever get the chance, I'll pay you out for this some day." And he meant it. A peep into his mind then would have startled Janet Orgreave, Mrs Nixon, and other persons who had a cult for the wistfulness of his appealing eyes. He steadily maintained silence, and the conflagration burnt itself out. "Are you going to look after the printing shop, or aren't you?" Darius growled at length. Edwin rose and went. As he passed through the shop, Stifford, who had in him the raw material of fine manners, glanced down, but not too ostentatiously, at a drawer under the counter. The printing office was more crowded than ever with men and matter. Some of the composing was now done on the ground floor. The whole organism functioned, but under such difficulties that could not be allowed to continue even by Darius Clayhanger. Darius had finally recognised that. "Oh!" said Edwin, in a tone of confidential intimacy to Big James. "I see they're getting on with the cleaning. Good! Father's beginning to get impatient, you know. It's the bigger cases that had better be done first." "Right it is, Mr Edwin," said Big James. The giant was unchanged. No sign of grey in his hair, and his cheek was smooth. Apparently his philosophy put him beyond the touch of time. "I say, Mr Edwin," he inquired in his majestic voice, "when are we going to rearrange all this?" He gazed around. Edwin laughed. "Soon," he said. "Won't be too soon," said Big James. Volume 2, Chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Clayhanger by Arnold Bennett. This LibriVox is in the public domain. Volume 2, Chapter 3. The New House. A house stood on a hill, and that hill was Bleakridge, the summit of the little billow of land between Bursley and Hanbridge. Trafalgar Road passed over the crest of the billow. Bleakridge was certainly not more than 100 feet higher than Bursley, yet people were now talking a lot about the advantage of living up at Bleakridge, above the smoke, and out of the town, though it was not more than 5 minutes from the Duck Bank. To hear them talking, one might have fancied that Bleakridge was away in the mountains somewhere. The new steam cars would pull you up there in 3 minutes or so, every quarter of an hour. It was really the new steam cars that were to be the making of Bleakridge as a residential suburb. It had also been predicted that even Hanbridge men would come to live at Bleakridge now. Land was changing owners at Bleakridge, and rising in price. Complete streets of lobbied cottages grew at angles from the main road, with the rapidity of that plant which pushes out, strangling branches more quickly than a man can run. And these lobbied cottages were at once occupied. Cottage property in the centre of the town depreciated. The land fronting the main road was destined not for cottages but for residences, semi-detached or detached. Osmond Orgreave had a good deal of this land under his control. He did not own it, he hawked it. Like all provincial and most London architects, he was a land broker in addition to being an architect. Before obtaining a commission to build a house, he frequently had to create the commission himself by selling a convenient plot, and then persuading the purchaser that, if he wished to retain the respect of the community, he must put on the plot a house worthy of the plot. The Orgreave family all had expensive tastes, and it was Osmond Orgreave's task to find most of the money needed for the satisfaction of those tastes. He always did find it, because the necessity was upon him, but he did not always find it easily. Janet would say sometimes: "We mustn't be so hard on father this month. Really, lately we've never seen him with his cheque book out of his hand." Undoubtedly the clothes on Janet's back were partly responsible for the celerity with which building land at Bleakridge was developed, just after the installation of steam cars in Trafalgar Road. TWO. Mr Orgreave sold a corner plot to Darius. He had had his eye on Darius for a long time before he actually shot him down, but difficulties connected with the paring of estimates for printing had somewhat estranged them. Orgreave had had to smooth out these difficulties, offer to provide a portion of the purchase money on mortgage from another client, produce a plan for a new house that surpassed all records of cheapness, produce a plan for the transforming of Darius's present residence into business premises, talk poetically about the future of printing in the Five Towns, and lastly demonstrate by digits that Darius would actually save money by becoming a property owner. He had had to do all this and more before Darius would buy. The two were regular cronies for about a couple of months. That is to say, between the payment of the preliminary deposit and the signing of the contract for building the house. But the contract signed, their relations were once more troubled. Orgreave had nothing to fear then, and besides he was using his diplomacy elsewhere. The house went up to the accompaniment of scenes in which only the proprietor was irate. Osmond Orgreave could not be ruffled. He could not be deprived of his air of having done a favour to Darius Clayhanger. His social and moral superiority, his real aloofness, remained absolutely unimpaired. The clear image of him as a fine gentleman was never dulled nor distorted, even in the mind of Darius. Nevertheless Darius hated the sight of the house ere the house was roofed in, but this did not diminish his pride in the house. He wished he had never set eyes on Osmond Orgreave. Yes, but the little boy from the Bastille was immensely content at the consequences of having set eyes on Osmond Orgreave. The little boy from the Bastille was achieving the supreme peak of greatness. He was about to live away from the business. Soon he would be going down to business of a morning. Soon he would be receiving 2 separate demand notes for rates. Soon he would be on a plane with the vainest earthenware manufacturer of them all. Ages ago he had got as far as a house with a lobby to it. Now it would be a matter of 2 establishments. Beneath all his discontents, moodiness, temper, and biliousness, lay this profound satisfaction of the little boy from the Bastille. Moreover, in any case, he would have been obliged to do something heroic, if only to find the room more and more imperiously demanded by his printing business. THREE. On the Saturday afternoon of Janet Orgreave's visit to the shop, Edwin went up to Bleakridge to inspect the house, and in particular the coloured lights in the upper squares of the drawing room and dining room windows. He had a key to the unpainted front door, and having climbed over various obstacles and ascended an inclined bending plank, he entered and stood in the square hall of the deserted, damp, and inchoate structure. The house was his father's only in name. In emotional fact it was Edwin's house, because he alone was capable of possessing it by enjoying it. To Darius, to Bursley in general, it was just a nice house, of red brick, with terracotta facings and red tiles, in the second Victorian style, the style that had broken away from Georgian austerity and first Victorian stucco and smugness, and wandered off vaguely into nothing in particular. To the plebeian in Darius it was of course grandiose and vast. To Edwin also, in a less degree. But to Edwin it was not a house, it was a work of art, it was an epic poem, it was an emanation of the soul. He did not realise this. He did not realise how the house had informed his daily existence. All that he knew about himself in relation to the house was that he could not keep away from it. He went and had a look at it nearly every morning before breakfast, when the workmen were fresh and lyrical. When the news came down to the younger generation that Darius had bought land and meant to build on the land, Edwin had been profoundly moved between apprehension and hope. His condition had been one of simple but intense expectant excitement. He wondered what his own status would be in the great enterprise of house building. All depended on Mr Orgreave. Would Mr Orgreave, of whom he had seen scarcely anything in 7 years, remember that he was intelligently interested in architecture? Or would Mr Orgreave walk right over him and talk exclusively to his father? He had feared, he had had a suspicion, that Mr Orgreave was an inconstant man. Mr Orgreave had remembered in the handsomest way. When the plans were being discussed, Mr Orgreave, with one word, a tone, a glance, had raised Edwin to the consultative level of his father. He had let Darius see that Edwin was in his opinion worthy to take part in discussions. And quite privately he had let Edwin see that Darius must not be treated too seriously. Darius, who really had no interest in 10,000 exquisitely absorbing details, had sometimes even said with impatience, "Oh, settle it how you like with Edwin." Edwin's own suggestions never seemed very brilliant, and Mr Orgreave was always able to prove to him that they were inadvisable; but they were never silly, like most of his father's, and he acquired leading ideas that transformed his whole attitude towards architecture. For example, he had always looked on a house as a front wall diversified by doors and windows, with rooms behind it. But when Mr Orgreave produced his first notions for the new house, Edwin was surprised to find that he had not even sketched the front. He had said, "We shall be able to see what the elevations look like when we've decided the plan a bit." And Edwin saw in a flash that the front of a house was merely the expression of the inside of it, merely a result, almost accidental. And he was astounded and disgusted that he, with his professed love of architecture and his intermittent study of it, had not perceived this obvious truth for himself. He never again looked at a house in the old irrational way. Then, when examining the preliminary sketch plan, he had put his finger on a square space and asked what room that was. "That isn't a room, that's the hall," said Mr Orgreave. "But it's square!" Edwin exclaimed. He thought that in houses to be lived in, the hall or lobby must necessarily be long and narrow. Now suddenly he saw no reason why a hall should not be square. Mr Orgreave had made no further remark about halls at the time, but another day, without any preface, he reopened the subject to Edwin, in a tone good naturedly informing, and when he had done Edwin could see that the shape of the hall depended on the shape of the house, and that halls had only been crushed and pulled into something long and narrow because the disposition of houses absolutely demanded this ugly negation of the very idea of a hall. Again he had to begin to think afresh, to see afresh. He conceived a real admiration for Osmond Orgreave, not more for his original and yet common sense manner of regarding things than for his aristocratic deportment, his equality to every situation, and his extraordinary skill in keeping his dignity and his distance during encounters with Darius. At the same time, when Darius would grumble savagely that Osmond Orgreave was `too clever by half,' Edwin could not deny that. Edwin's sisters got a good deal of Mr Orgreave through Edwin. He could never keep Mr Orgreave very long to himself. He gave away a great deal of Mr Orgreave's wisdom without mentioning the origin of the gift. Thus occasionally Clara would say cuttingly, "I know where you've picked that up. You've picked that up from Mr Orgreave." The young man Benbow, to whom the infant Clara had been so queerly engaged, also received from Edwin considerable quantities of Mr Orgreave. But the fellow was only a decent, dull, pushing, successful ass, and quite unable to assimilate Mr Orgreave. Edwin could never comprehend how Clara, so extremely difficult to please, so carping and captious, could mate herself to a fellow like Benbow. She had done so, however. They were recently married. Edwin was glad that that was over, for it had disturbed him in his attentions to the house. FOUR. When the house began to go up, Edwin lived in an ecstasy of contemplation. I say with deliberateness, an ecstasy. He had seen houses go up before. He knew that houses were constructed brick by brick, beam by beam, lath by lath, tile by tile. He knew that they did not build themselves, and yet in the vagueness of his mind he had never imaginatively realised that a house was made with hands, and hands that could err. With its exact perpendiculars and horizontals, its geometric regularities, and its Chinese preciseness of fitting, a house had always seemed to him, again in the vagueness of his mind, as something superhuman. The commonest cornice, the most ordinary pillar of a staircase balustrade, could that have been accomplished in its awful perfection of line and contour by a human being? How easy to believe that it was not made with hands! But now he saw, he had to see. He saw a hole in the ground, with water at the bottom, and the next moment that hole was a cellar. Not an amateur cellar, a hole that would do at a pinch for a cellar, but a professional cellar. He appreciated the brains necessary to put a brick on another brick with just the right quantity of mortar in between. He thought the house would never get itself done. One brick at a time, and each brick cost a farthing. Slow, careful, yes, and even finicking. But soon the bricklayers had to stand on plank platforms in order to reach the raw top of the wall that was ever rising above them. The measurements, the rulings, the plumbings, the checkings... He was humbled, and he was enlightened. He understood that a miracle is only the result of miraculous patience, miraculous nicety, miraculous honesty, miraculous perseverance. He understood that there was no golden and magic secret of building. It was just putting one brick on another, and against another, but to a hair's breadth. It was just like anything else. For instance, printing. He saw even printing in a new light. And when the first beams were bridged across two walls... The funny thing was that the men's fingers were thick and clumsy. Never could such fingers pick up a pin. And still they would manoeuvre 100 weight of timber to a pin's point. FIve. He stood at the drawing-room bay window, of which each large pane had been marked with the mystic sign of a white circle by triumphant glaziers, and looked across the enclosed fragment of clayey field that ultimately would be the garden. The house was at the corner of Trafalgar Road and a side street that had lobbied cottages down its slope. The garden was oblong, with its length parallel to Trafalgar Road, and separated from the pavement only by a high wall. The upper end of the garden was blocked by the first of 3 new houses which Osmond Orgreave was building in a terrace. These houses had their main fronts on the street. They were quite as commodious as the Clayhangers', but much inferior in garden space. Their bits of flower plots lay behind them. And away behind their flower plots, with double entrance gates in another side street, stretched the grounds of Osmond Orgreave, his house in the sheltered middle thereof. He had got cheaply one of the older residential properties of the district, Georgian, of a recognisable style, relic of the days when manufacturers formed a class entirely apart from their operatives. Even as far back as 1880, any operative might with luck become an employer. The south-east corner of the Clayhanger garden touched the north-west corner of the domains of Orgreave. For a few feet the two gardens were actually contiguous, with naught but an old untidy thorn hedge between them. This hedge was to be replaced by a wall that would match the topmost of the lobbied cottages, which bounded the view of the Clayhangers to the east. From the bay window Edwin could see over the hedge, and also through it on to the croquet lawn of the Orgreaves. Croquet was then in its first avatar. Nothing was more dashing than croquet. With rag balls and home-made mallets the Clayhanger children had imitated croquet in their yard in the 70s. The Orgreaves played real croquet. One of them had shone in a tournament at Buxton. Edwin noticed a figure on the gravel between the lawn and the hedge. He knew it to be Janet, by the crimson frock. But he had no notion that Janet had stationed herself in that quarter with intent to waylay him. He could not have credited her with such a purpose. Nor could his modesty have believed that he was important enough to employ the talent of the Orgreaves for agreeable chicane. The fact was that Janet had been espying him for a quarter of an hour. When at length she waved her hand to him, it did not occur to him to suppose that she was waving her hand to him. He merely wondered what peculiar thing she was doing. Then he blushed as she waved again, and he knew, first from the blood in his face, that Janet was making a signal, and that it was to himself that the signal was directed. His body had told his mind. This was very odd. Of course he was obliged to go out. And he went, muttering to himself. VOLUME 2.